Hi, everyone. Welcome to the BYOD webinar. Thanks so much for joining this opportunity to explore best practices for a BYOD policy. My name is Chrissy Booth, and I'm on the Digital Youth Development team at BGCA, and I'm joined today by four panelists. We have LeVar Jones from Boys and Girls Club of Greater Washington, Brian Dennis from the Boys and Girls Club of Yellowstone County. We're hoping to be joined by Evie Saba from the Boys and Girls Club of Flagstaff, and finally Mitru Charlante, who is BGCA's Director of Child and Club Safety. So we're grateful for the panelists, and of course we're also joined by 158 of you who registered for this panel. And you all range from having little to no exposure to a bring your own device policy to a few people who have already implemented the policy and are just looking for strategies to improve. So we're glad to have you all here. You may have noticed by now a few options for engagement during this webinar. There is a chat function to the right of the video, which you may need to sign in to view. You should feel free to type in questions or comments, and Abby Fiddler will help translate your questions into questions that our panelists can answer. Also, you may have noticed that below the video there are some resources. You may need to click show more in order to see them, but those are things like a downloadable bring your own device policy, a social media policy, and a few other resources for talking about online safety. So if bring your own device is a brand new concept for you, it's basically the idea that schools and after-school organizations and businesses are allowing people to bring their own digital devices to use when it supports program goals. So BYOD is not a one-size-fits-all thing. It's not one consistent policy that is going to be the same for every club. It's something that you can customize and adapt based on your needs. And so we wanted to host a bring your own device policy because if you haven't noticed, digital engagement, whether it's talking on the phone or texting or using social media or online learning or creating digital media is very important to youth today. And so we as youth development professionals have an opportunity, and I would say a responsibility, to consider digital engagement when we're thinking about youth development. So thank you all for showing your concern for the digital aspect of youth development by being here with us today. So before I toss this over to our panelists, I want to give you a few high-level reasons why you might be interested in a BYOD policy. One is that devices are everywhere, and it's usually good to get ahead of things instead of having to react when something's happening and you need to decide what to do about it. So it's good to get ahead of that and have a policy on the front end. Secondly, having a BYOD policy could be really great for recruiting and retaining teens. We know that teens are particularly interested in digital engagement, and so having a policy for when they could productively use devices could be really helpful. Also, we know that an outright ban of devices sometimes leads to surreptitious use, and so by having a policy that makes sense and that everyone is on the same page about, you can avoid sort of secretive use of devices, which sometimes leads to unsafe situations. And finally, but probably the most important thing, is that a bring your own device policy can support program goals, whether it's making digital media on My.Future or playing the Sky game for Money Matters, looking up some support for homework on Power Hour, or learning coding. There are a lot of opportunities where BYOD can bolster and improve our program offerings. So with that said, I'm going to hand this over to our panelists, and I'll ask our panelists if you would say your name the first time you speak, just so that everyone can match a face to a name. And my first question is just, what benefits of a bring your own device policy have you experienced? And when youth are bringing cell phones, tablets, laptops to the club, what are they doing with them?
So, hey everybody, I'll jump in. This is LeVar Jones. I am the Team Program Director at the FBR branch of the Boys and Girls Club of Greater Washington here in the nation's capital. And so for me, this is critical. Chrissy talked about, specifically BYOD policies in teen space. We're fortunate to be the home of the DC Best Buy Teen Tech Center, And so technology is a major piece of what we do here. And as much as we realize too that, again, there's no way to escape the place of technology in the lives of our teens. And so we're very clear in terms of expectations for what that policy looks like and what young people are bringing into the space. We're very open in terms of, cell phones and tablets, you can use them, but we also start with the foundation, and that is the relationship that we share with the young people that we serve. And I found that to be the most critical piece of it. I think, key to anything else that we do programmatically, operations-wise, building it upon the relationship that we have with our young people, and so that when we are having conversations around what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, it doesn't feel as evasive. And so teenagers are less likely to bristle up, sort of back off. They understand it is coming from a place of concern and care for their well-being. And so that, for us, keeping that in the forefront is what's really helped our policy to be smooth with the least amount of bumps that we can have as possible.
Good morning, everybody. This is Brian. Can you hear me? Everybody, this is Brian Dennis. And, for us, we've had a bring your own device policy for the last several years. And what's been interesting is there hasn't been near the massive influx of devices and things like that, and it hasn't impacted negatively the engagement with the kids. But it does create some, like LeVar was saying, the opportunity to those engagements. Even when the kids have the devices out, it's not just where the staff go sit behind the desk. Like LeVar's talking, we're out there engaging with them. We have what we call our cell phone parking lot, where the kids will, when we have free time, when they can bring their devices out, we've got an area, staff are roaming it, engaging, hey, what are you doing? What's going on? Those sorts of things. So, we focused heavily on maintaining that connection, so it wasn't a chance for them to escape what we're trying to do. The other side of this is we started really with the families, and where we started to see it and was, parents wanting to have their kids have a phone so they could get a hold of them in case of an emergency. I mean, that's been a real big deal. And as we frankly built our emergency operations plans, so we could deal in case of, a fire or anything like that. As we were building that, as we were learning, one of the hardest things in any emergency situation is going to be communication. And if your building goes down or you can't use your building, how are you going to get word to families, those sorts of things. So as we built that in, mobile devices, kids devices, those sorts of things became part of our communications nexus. The parents want to know where their kids are and are they okay. That's all they care about. So if we can have the kids help us say, hey, Mom, I'm here, I'm okay, come get me, that cuts down on the confusion, calms parents. We can deal with some of those things. But what's been really fascinating, we fully expected a major influx of devices and lots of problems. And for the last couple of years, we just simply haven't seen that. As we focus on the experience, we bring the devices out in the light where the kids say, hey, you can bring them. It's no longer cool to try and sneak them in. Well, yeah, I can have my phone at the club. It wasn't, they're not trying to hide them anymore. We have time for them to use them, then they put them away, and we can focus on what we're doing with the rest of the experience.
Hi, this is Mitru.
Go ahead.
I would just add, build on what I'm hearing directly from the clubs, and I, picking up on the transparency piece. So that's what I've heard as well, that having the bring your own device policies and practices, then it just takes away, as Brian was just pointing out, the secrecy, but also, the transparency around expectations for members around conduct and behavior related to devices and all of that just brings it out into the open where, again, we can take a youth development approach and be very clear in communicating behavioral expectations, what the accountabilities would be for violating anything like that. And it's an opportunity for mentoring appropriate social behavior and use of the devices. So that echoes, what I'm hearing as well. Thanks for sharing that.
Nice. Thanks. So I'm wondering, we've heard a couple of examples of things that are best practices. Like Brian mentioned a cell phone parking lot, and LeVar mentioned teens knowing it's coming from a place of concern, Mitri, the transparency issue. So what are some other pieces of your bring your own device policy that you would consider a best practice? Like what are some of the examples of times when you say that youth should or should not use devices?
I think I'll jump in here first, because we spent a great deal of time talking about and really looking at it, I think, from the wrong angle. What do we need to avoid? And one of the areas that we were really concerned about, and we battle to an extent, is parents using it as a convenient mechanism to notify their kids and say, hey, I'm coming to get you, get gathered up. And so we've been very clear with our families, and when we find out about it, and it's always going to happen, we've been very clear that the kids are not permitted to call their parents and say, hey, I want to go home, and the parents aren't permitted to call and say, hey, get your stuff together, I'm coming to get you, or go ahead and check out. Because again, at the end of the day, we still don't know who's calling them. I mean, it could be anybody. So that was one of the things that we spent a lot of time on, and it works pretty well that we're not, we're not using that as a way for them to circumvent parents coming in and being engaged in the program, kids trying to use it to get out. They still have to set things up ahead of time. They can't use their phones to get around that.
So for us, we, I think to Brian's point also, we switched how we approached it, and we intentionally build device usage into our programming. And so making sure, whether it is BGCA programming, which, a nod to BGCA for really, I think, going the mile and making sure that technology is infused more in, national programs like Keystone and Passport. But even going a step further and figuring out how we can have teens utilize devices within programming. So, designing a specific session around iPad use, being able to have the investment to have devices in the club for young people that don't. And I'll come back to that too, because I think that's another part of that. But making sure, again, that we figure out very intentional ways where young people are using the technology in a programmatic way, because then again, that helps them to discover how technology can be used in an appropriate manner. It's the whole notion of don't touch the iron because it's going to burn you. So I was that kid that touched the iron several times, because my mom said not to touch it. So versus going at it from that angle, really trying to provide ways. One of the ways I think that we've really been able to hone in on that is with image makers. We got a booming digital photography program here, and these days everybody's a photographer. All you need is a smartphone. Even if you have a flip phone, which I hope no one still has flip phones. If you have a flip phone, it's 9 times out of 10 it's going to have a camera. Figuring out ways to get young people to own the responsibility that comes with having technology, having those conversations about what it means. A lot of those conversations lately with $1,000 iPhone 7s. Having the conversation about what it means to be responsible for that, teaching that responsibility through program outcomes, and giving them, tools to be able to really use the technology responsibly, not only in the club, but that also promotes responsible technology and device use outside of the club. And so if they're learning that in the club, more than likely, they're not going to be the kid recording the fight at the club. They're going to be the ones maybe using that cell phone to call someone to come and help, in the fight. So figuring out ways that we can do that. The other piece of it that I honestly think that we're still working through is how this communicates to young people who don't have a device to bring. And what that means, especially, for communities, and it's different for every community, but how we provide a resource for young people who don't have a device to bring, and how we make it so that those young people don't feel like they are cut out. It's almost created somewhat of a new digital divide, if you will, for young people that don't have that access, that don't have that cool factor per se, and really trying to build in, you know, the perks of being at the club. So even if you don't have a device to bring, you've got a device for you.
That's awesome. I just want to point out, LeVar, I think this is such an important thing for clubs to consider as they're figuring out how to tailor a bring your own device policy to their context. And there's a section in the bring your own device template where we try to prompt that kind of thinking by saying, for purposes of equity, that program activities are never going to require that every member has a device, because we want to ensure that everyone is welcome and encouraged to participate in program goals, whether they're bringing a device or not. So thank you so much for highlighting that. I think that's a really important part of this. So anyone else want to share best practices, or are we ready to go on to challenges? Okay, so my next question for you all is, what are 2 or 3 challenges that you've encountered with bring your own device policies, either before you had a policy or now that you have one? And how have you either overcome these challenges or guarded against confronting some of the types of challenges people are worried about around bring your own device?
So I'll jump in on this one. One of the things that we, you know, and I am Mr. Teen. I am teen advocate chief in the building, and that's my job, and I take it very seriously. And so finding the balance between BYOD policies in teen spaces and BYOD policies in younger member spaces, particularly when they are in the same building. When you really get into things like infrastructure, is it viable? And this is a challenge for us that we at our club are dealing with and facing every day, and still have not figured it out all the way. So we're working through it. But, you know, you get into issues like infrastructure. Is it feasible to have 2 separate networks? Is it feasible to have varying levels of access, you know, in one building on one network? So those are, right now, I would say for us, that's the biggest challenge in terms of how we create a safe space for our younger members and our teens, what that looks like in terms of the infrastructure, what it looks like in terms of the access. We're fortunate, again, you know, to have access to resources and to be able to have young people that can come in, you know, and that are flexible enough as we're working through those, and even with our families too. And I think the other challenge for us right now is dealing with the realities of teaching the digital citizenship component of BYOD policies. And I know I've looked at the template, I've got to look back again. But again, having that conversation with young people in a world where, in most cases, what we are saying is contrary to everything else that they're hearing. Every other message that they're hearing about being a good digital citizen with access to the world in the palm of your hand, what that type of power means. You look at it from the aspect of bullying, cyberbullying, all the different pieces that come with that. And so that, I think, is an ongoing challenge and a conversation, again, to have both with young people and with families. It gets trickier, I think, on the family engagement side as you get into the teen space, because parents often sometimes drift away from being, you know, directly involved with what their teenagers are doing. We push and encourage parents to be more involved, but again, you know, we approach it from the relationship perspective, the youth development perspective, so that teens are not feeling like we are trying to invade their space, but giving, you know, enough latitude there. So those, I think for us, are the 2 challenges: infrastructure and shared spaces and creating safe spaces for teens and younger kids, but then also the digital citizenship and responsibility.
And I think, you know, LeVar talking about, you know, kind of teaching them to be good digital citizens, for lack of a better term. You know, one of the things as we were rolling this out that we ran into and resulted in, a staff member being let go. They don't necessarily, or they didn't necessarily at the time think it's any big deal. The staff showed them how to pirate a video, and it was a brand new movie. I can't remember now what it was. Might have been Star Wars or something like that. It's like, wait, that can't possibly be out. It just is still in the theaters. So, having that conversation, helping them understand that just because you can get it on the internet or just because it's out there, doesn't mean that it's, that it's appropriate to be doing. Just because it's available doesn't mean it's for you. And that I think that's an ongoing discussion. The infrastructure thing is a constant, and like a lot of the digital stuff, from whether it's administrative on down to the kids doing something, it's a constant moving target. And it's just one more thing from an organizational leadership standpoint that we have to watch. So that is a constant challenge. And, so we get a grant for our new clubhouse that has some really cool new stuff. And then how do you make sure that you create some parity between your sites to make sure the kids have similar opportunities, even though they might not have had that funding? So, the constant battle to chase that infrastructure piece. Can you afford another T1 line in kind of a thing where you can add bandwidth and stuff like that. So those are really the two big challenges, aside from member behavior, that always makes life interesting.
Let's see. Ebby or Mitru, any additional challenges that we haven't heard yet? Ways that you would overcome that challenge, or ways that you would apprehend and guard against a challenge?
Am I unmuted? Oops. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I thought I was still muted. Sorry about the delay. Yeah, there's just so many great examples in the scenarios that we heard directly from the clubs. So just to build on some of that, I think, a big takeaway for us should be that what we're talking about in terms of youth development, codes of conduct, and supervision, those issues, it's not extremely different than what we need to do every day in clubs. So to think of it that way, like, how do we build on the culture, the codes of conduct, the staff ethical behaviors, all of those things that are already in place, just the way that technology has integrated itself into our lives. It's, our safety culture needs to be integrated into the mentoring around the digital behavior, digital technology. And, it's such a part of workforce development now, leadership development, and these are great opportunities for the clubs to help mentor and shape those behaviors that, we're hearing about. So I just heard a lot of issues thrown out there, potential bullying, potential around piracy, things like that. So, we think about safety issues. We think about the risks that we can identify before they happen, that, might happen. Think about ways to mitigate those, and conversations, policies, things that need to be set up ahead of time. But a real concrete example, I think, that is best practice around some of these challenges is having some of those prerequisites for requirements for staff and for members for using devices or for using particular apps on devices, things like that. So I don't know, I'm sure our club examples here have things like that in place, but thinking through and setting up those kind of parameters ahead of time is really helpful.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay, so let's get into a few more specifics of what has worked in some of the clubs that you've experienced. One question that I've heard people ask is about infrastructure. So what are some best practices for sharing wireless? I know there was a concern that too many devices on one wireless network might slow it down, or if clubs are using firewalls to kind of determine which websites members can navigate to and which they cannot. You might have different preferences for websites that your staff would need access to, but that your members wouldn't. So what are some best practices for setting up a wireless network to support a bring your own device policy and a good culture of digital engagement?
I guess I'll jump in here first. One of the, we, for the longest time, they could bring their devices, but they had to use whatever their cellular carrier was. And I know me personally, my daughter who's 13, she does not have a phone. She has an iPod. So, kids that are doing that, they can't, they don't have the 3G, or 4G, I guess,
right,
or LTE, whatever it is this week. But, so what we've done is we've worked with our IT provider, our IT contractor here, and we have essentially built a separate connection inside of our wireless signal inside the buildings, and it's the team one, and they can, it's open, they can log in. It doesn't have the bandwidth. We control that through the settings and things like that. So I mean, they do have their own. A lot of them still use 3G, but for those that don't, it seems to work, and we're able to regulate that bandwidth so it's not dipping into what we need for check-in, check-out, what we need for the operations of the business. So that seems to work pretty well, and it wasn't terribly expensive. We were in the process of replacing the wireless access points anyway with they look like little Frisbees, but they work really well, and it wasn't too big a deal for them to just set that up for us, and it seems to be working.
Great. Any other thoughts on infrastructure, or is that sort of a good summary for everyone's experience?
Yes, I'll just add one, Brian. I'm taking notes, so thank you for that one. For us, I know we have one Wi-Fi we now have a staff Wi-Fi for the building and a general Wi-Fi for guests, parents, members, etc. Those both Wi-Fis, both Wi-Fi systems match our hardwired internet access as well. So the same firewalls that we have for our Ethernet, we have on our wireless as well. And so we do have, what helps with that is we have we've got staff members are given, full-time staff members are given a bypass code because it is a pretty strong firewall. And I think, for a lot of groups, a lot of clubs will probably be working through figuring out what to phase out, what to filter out. Sometimes it will filter out sites that are actually purposeful, educational, and so we're working with our IT team to figure those out. But in cases where we do, need access, full-time staff, full-time staff do have access to a bypass, but then we're able to track. So, in terms of, making sure to hold staff accountable to, our ethical policy, making sure that, staff understand that bypass code is able to be tracked, and we're able to see what sites, we're given access to with that bypass passcode. So I think, again, this is one of the areas that for us is evolving. And so I'm definitely interested in talking to Brian more also about figuring out how the multiple network piece works and giving young people an access, because it does. It communicates a lot. And again, from the team perspective, to say to potential members, come to the club. We've got, and one of the things, you go to your aunt's house now and you ask, what's the Wi-Fi passcode? So it's become a big part of that. To Brian's point, we've got a lot of young people who have devices that do not have cellular service. And so being able to communicate to them, whether it's for social purposes, academic purposes, what have you, that, hey, you've got access here at the club. And it just speaks volumes being able to communicate that, I think, as a marketing tool, and sort of as creating that ecosystem where young people feel engaged and connected and excited to be there.
Nice, thanks. So another sort of specific question for you all. How should the bring your own device policy differ based on age group or program areas or time of day? What are some of the different considerations you take into place when you're setting the expectations for when and how and who can engage online?
I guess I'll jump back in here first again. You know, that was another one of the conversations as we went down this road. We spent a fair bit of time on, and the outcome of that conversation was, for us to bring your own device, you've got to be a fourth grader. You know, as we looked at it, we felt that was where we could start to have some conversations. We could, you know, they were old enough. And for the most part, we are not seeing here much younger than that where there's a significant presence. So, you know, once they were fourth graders, they can bring that. We have the conversations, like I said earlier, with the parents before they can bring them. That's part of the registration process every session. So beginning of school year and beginning of summer, parents have to sign off that it's okay. And it's been rather interesting to watch when I get a chance to help with some registration. There's a lot of parents that say, yeah, no, they don't need to have that, or they don't have that device. So it's not a thing. You know, so they were older, and, you know, we haven't gotten as far as what LeVar's talking about, and that's one of the things that we're trying to figure out, and LeVar, I'm probably going to call you, is, you know, how we integrate it into some of our programming. You know, our part-time staff that do a lot of that work, they're a little more adept, and we're starting to dabble in that. But, you know, when they're bringing their phones out for that parking lot time, we're very clear up front that, you know what, we'll do that when we have the opportunity. You know, if we have the staffing, we'll make it happen. But if we don't, we don't. So, you know, we're not going to just shut the whole place down. It's, you know, if we've got some free games room time, there'll be a spot in the games room where we've got a staff, they can have their devices out. It's a little more lenient in the teen center. They've got a little more latitude there. But, you know, they're just different creatures, those older kids. So that's kind of how we've set things up here.
Yeah, I think Brian hit it on the head there. You know, the teen space definitely comes with, you know, there's a different level of expectation. And so I think even the conversation that we've been having with our 8th graders, so our teen center space is 9th grade through 12th. So we are having the conversation with our 8th graders as they are preparing to transition into the teen center, you know, slowly this year and into next year, about what that means. Again, responsibility, accountability, ownership, you know, being able to take initiative, not having to have someone to have to walk around you, you know, all the things that, you know, that again come with a teen space. And so having that conversation is critical because again, it is, you know, and there are going to be moments. There are going to be moments where, you know, you have something gets through the crack, but you use that as a teachable moment. You know, I think the wrong response is to freak out and shut the network off and put everybody's device in a box and say we're never going to use this evil technology again. Because at the end of the day, it is, you know, unless you've been under a rock for the last 2 decades, it is the essence of our society. And that might be a little heavy for some folks, but it really is. I've been 20 minutes from home and turn back around and go get my cell phone because I left it at home. You know, we exist, we live through these devices. And so it really becomes a thing of helping to prepare. It's future readiness. And so it's as much as our responsibility to teach how to use these devices for our children as it is responsible for us to prepare them for college or for the workforce. It's a part of what we do. And the reality is, if I have a child that's 10 years old, no, they're not going to have a device. But there are kids who are coming in our clubs who are 9 and 10 years old with, $700, $800, $900 devices. So how do we change our framework? How do we change our ideologies? How do we even move our personal thoughts out of the picture so that we can create, a space that's safe for them and that really engages and helps them to use it? So again, in the teen space, there is more, leverage, but also with that becomes more responsibility that again we put back into the hands of our young people as a teachable moment.
And I guess if I can add one more part to your point, we can't freak out when they do something that doesn't conform to what we're trying to accomplish. Firsthand, we had the second day of summer when we rolled out our one of our clubhouses, and the kid shouldn't have even had a phone, but apparently it was his father's phone or an old phone, and Dad had forgot to clear videos. So he was showing his buddy a video of a guy and a gal doing some stuff that is totally out of line for a club and any of those sorts of things. Yeah, it was funny, Abby. Really, really entertained me. But the fact of the matter was, our staff were like, "Oh my God, what are we going to do?" It's like, you know what? Let's have the conversation with the parents. The parent of the boy that had the phone, very upset or very embarrassed. It was a divorced family, so you can imagine how that conversation went. And the parents of the boy that saw the video, they weren't excited, but they understood that those things happen from time to time, and that we were addressing it properly. So you can't get too far out and get too wound up, because at the end of the day, it's no different than a kid slipping and falling and breaking their arm on the playground. You've got to respond to those things because this is the world those kids live in. So if we can teach them how to function in that environment and deal with the things that they're going to face, they're going to be better off, even though it's difficult and rather embarrassing in the short term.
So let's actually
I just want to add to this one. I just want to add that one of the main things that, like, for example, the clubs we work with, we don't separate the internet access or filtering or any of that stuff based on age. So when the kids come in and log in at the club, it's a safer place than if they were out doing it on their own, or they were, like LeVar said, they go to their aunt's house and they have free internet access. This is not the future. This is now. The mobile devices are part of our life now. It's part of kids' life now. It's if we're not taking advantage of it, if we're not coming up with the systems to make sure it's available for the kids to use, we are really behind the times. So it's very encouraging to hear all the discussion because you guys are on the right track. Infrastructure is important to that, and as clubs becomes more comfortable with it, and as bandwidth cost becomes less and less, it's becoming more realistic that the clubs could do that. But Brian, it was interesting to hear about what was on the phone already, because that happens at the school level too. So a lot of times we find out that kids come in, bring in information from the school that other friends shared with them, and they try to run it at the club and bypass filters and do all that stuff. And you know what? At least the club is trying to protect them from getting there. But it's always going to happen. That's part of the game. But yes, bringing their own devices, it's perfect. And I'll leave it there.
So I want to go off of this idea that a few people have mentioned that occasionally things will go wrong. These teachable moments that LeVar brought up. So what if you were just going to generalize for staff that are getting ready to implement a bring your own device policy and understand that it's not going to be perfect, something is going to go wrong with a device. What's your advice for how do you respond when members use devices inappropriately or somehow related to the BYOD policy, something goes wrong or slips through the cracks?
So we had an incident a week ago where this was the case, and somewhat towards Brian's story, we had a young man who had something on his cell phone that should not have been there, and was sharing with me something that we were working on here in the club. Went to go swipe one direction, and some other things popped up. And so again, I go back to understanding for me, it is about the relationship that you have. There's no way in the world that you can have a teachable moment if you don't have the ear of the young person that you're trying to have that teachable moment with. And so I think that's going to determine how you approach it, because again, that's a moment where either that young person is going to listen or they're going to fly. And so either you have to, one, you got to relax. You got to make sure that you're level-headed as you approach the situation, because if you freak out, then that young person is going to feel, they internalize that. And in turn, oh, I've done bad, I'm wrong. And, that child may or may not make a reinterest back into the club space. So the first, I think, is to stay level-headed. Depending on what that moment is, depending on the age that you're working with, determining what level of parent interaction and engagement you have to bring in to that, because there are some moments that that may not necessarily be the case where you have to. In this particular case, because of the relationship with the young person and with the parent, we were able to have. I was able to have a one-on-one with the team, and then a separate one-on-one with the parent. And be able to, allow that moment to say, okay, well, here's how we're gonna move forward. So we put some steps in place to check in. It brought in, and just not to skirt around it, it brought up the issue of young people watching pornography. And again, that gets into touchy areas, but it is an area that our young people are exploring and that they are looking into. And so it opened up a whole dialogue that we were able to safely have in that, in the space of the club. So one, stay level-headed. Two, figure out what parent engagement, needs to be done. And then three, make plans. I think making steps and action plans for that young person to correct the behavior, making sure they know it's not the end of the world. Everybody has a faux pas, a slip up, but here are the steps we're going to take to make sure that we don't have that again. The last thing I would say is just to keep, those are yellow or red flags. And 9 times out of 10, it's going to shed light into a corner where there's probably a deeper issue or another issue that may be on the surface or underneath the surface that you got to get into. So just making sure that you're staying aware of that. Don't just sweep it under the rug and pretend like it didn't happen, but be alert and be aware for what else that might be pointing to.
I think Chrissy too, and LeVar, I mean, we've seen similar things. I mean, the young guys with the dad's phone, but from a little different perspective, as the CEO here, a lot of conversation has been had and continues to be had. How do we eliminate risk for doing these things? At the end of the day, we wake up and we're a risk. Every time I walk through the door at work, everything we do is a risk. So those things, I guess, to an extent, getting comfortable with understanding that. But where we think we've had some success, and we didn't rush it, we didn't dawdle, but when we put this in play, we put a lot of effort and energy on the front end of making sure that our staff understood, our staff had buy-in. A lot of what we do is a direct result of the conversation that I had and our leadership team had with our clubhouse folks, right down to the part-timers and the high school kids. What can we do? What do you so they were involved in the process. And then, we spent a lot of time talking to our board, starting with the leadership, and it was the focus of a rather engaged meeting with our board. There were a lot of folks very concerned, the typical questions, what about risk? And if they do this and if they do that, what's going to happen? So as we put that whole plan together, it's like any other plan. You've got to have your contingencies, and in the plan, and it's very clear to the parents, and we make sure they understand it when they sign off, is, here's what's acceptable. And we start there. Here's the behaviors we're looking for. Here's the behaviors we're just simply not going to accept. and here's how we're going to address those things. So, that's all built into the plan. And I think for us, it was, having the whole team involved in the development. It wasn't something that I came back with and said, hey, we're going to do this. And they go, oh God, here he goes again. It was the whole team being involved and everybody on the same page before we rolled out. And frankly, we've been at it long enough now that it just is what it is. And we don't really think too much about it because we were all there at the beginning.
I just want to add a quick thing in here. This is no different than when the clubs went through bringing internet services to the clubs and opening up for the kids. It's the same discussion we had 15 years ago, the same that's going on right now. And I think parent involvement is very important on this because they are the ones who are, like, in the first place, putting these mobile devices in the hands of kids. So I don't know how many of the clubs are creating an opportunity to do, hey, look, you know what? If you're a parent and you give one of your kids a mobile device, these are the things that could happen. These are the things that can be exposed to. And I think if we start, pushing more data back to the parents who are actually the ultimate responsible for putting that device in their hands, it's going to be easier. They're going to understand that, hey, look, we're going to try our best. Kids are going to explore. Kids are curious. We did it when we were their age. I don't expect them not to do what I did. And it becomes a better partnership. And a lot of the clubs we work with, part of the approach that I try to work with the clubs on, it's a partnership between us and the parents. It's a service we need to provide. It's a service we need to give to the kids. But the more the parents know, the easier it is. So it's no different, in my opinion, than when we tried. We had the same discussions a long time ago. Brian, I think you were part of them too, on when we brought in the internet to the club, and can we do that? Can we have a permission? What are the parents going to think? What happens when they go to a bad site? What is a bad site? It's the same discussion all over again, and I think it just went a step further. Before, the devices were sitting statically in a defined space. Now these devices are mobile and in their hands. And if we look at it from that perspective, it's not that different. Now, obviously, like we talked earlier, it brings in bandwidth, infrastructure issues, all that with it. But it's really, from a policy perspective, it's almost the same thing. The harder part is we don't have full control on it because we don't always own the device. So that's very important to get the people who are the owners of the device involved in the discussion and understanding the different options that they may have when they use such a device.
Yeah, and Ebby, I'll jump in. I don't think I go back quite as far as the discussion when we're going to bring internet into the buildings, but
okay, you're trying to make me look old. I see, got it.
But I guess to your point that we don't have, they're not our devices, so there's some question marks on what we have access to. It's a lot similar to do we have the right to search a kid's backpack? In the event of an immediate risk or harm, I'll send my team into backpacks, but it's in our policy that, if there's something on that phone and the kid isn't willing to, let us get a look at that, say, hey, can we look at that? And they say no. Our next call is to mom or dad, and they're coming down right now. No options. We're going on that phone. We're going to hold it until they get here. We won't look at it. But again, it goes back to the conversation at the front end, where everybody's aware, everybody's involved in the initial process, and it just at least for us, and maybe we're unique, we just haven't run into a lot of massive issues, which will probably happen this afternoon now that I've said it. But we haven't run into major problems because we put so much effort and energy on the front side of this, so people were on board before we rolled it.
Nice. So I want to ask all of you if, as panelists, you feel like there's anything that we're missing from this conversation right now. Are there any topics within BYOD that you expected to talk about and you haven't heard us mention yet? Or do you want to voice a question for the rest of the panel?
I just want to add something quick for everyone is you need to be prepared to take advantage of bring your own device. You do need to make sure that your club infrastructure is in place, that things are thought over, the things that Brian and LeVar talked about, they need to be implemented, because otherwise you are opening a door for challenges for you. But it's the thing that I want to say is, and I was trying to mention earlier, it's no different than challenges we faced before. This is not something new. It just looks a little bit different, but it's really the same thing we had to deal with before, and we have done it successfully. You know, kids in our clubs, and every club in the nation is accessing internet, is accessing information. It is part of today. It's not the future. It is today. This is how they handle stuff. You know, kids who are going to school, are going to college, they all are using mobile devices in their scheduling, in their research, and their assignment, and getting their emails, and their even security. You know, when something happens, they all get notified. So it's not going to go away. Actually, it's going to get better and better. And if we put away the thinking or trying to build that infrastructure, or trying to make the investment in time and effort to make sure that this is available for our kids in a meaningful way, in a safe way, we are falling behind then. So don't be afraid, guys. Jump in. I think there's a lot of talent on the panel and within the clubs that, you know, have tried certain stuff, failed at stuff, adjusted, but it is not that hard.
Hey, Chrissy, this is Mitru. I would just ask the clubs who are participating here a question that I get asked a lot. How do you help ensure the safety and security of the personal devices, the individual devices? So how do you prevent theft and loss? I get that question a lot on club site visits. I'd love to hear your feedback.
Well, could you ask an easy question, Mitru? You know, this is probably one of the more difficult pieces. And again, it's no different in my mind. I mean, in scale it is, but it's no different than the kids, you know, bringing Pokemon cards or whatever. You know, I mean, we don't require them to bring the device. I mean, it's not something that's you got to have it to come to club. You know, and if they're carrying it and it's on their person, and we don't see much for tablets or anything like that. We really discourage those larger devices that the kids can't put in their pocket, simply for this reason. You know, my son has a Kindle Fire and he wants to bring it. I'm like, no, you leave it at home. You know, so I mean, but again, it's engaging with them and saying, hey, you know, they're welcome to bring them, but they're their responsibility. And if something happens, and you know, and it gets taken, we'll do what we can to help with that. And get it recovered, and we try and set it up so you know they're not leaving them somewhere. Or if we do take them, we've got them in a drawer behind the desk that you know no kids can have access to, that sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, you know what? If we're making this accommodation, if they bring it, if it gets broken because they're messing around, it ends up missing because they laid it down. Got to be a level of accountability that the kids have to share in being able to bring that. So. It's probably not the best answer, but so far it works pretty well.
I just want to throw in there that some of the clubs we're working with, the way they're handling this is because now they have invested in, again, it's an infrastructure piece where they had cameras in the building that are monitoring what's going on. And if an incident happened, you know, they are able to rewind, review, and see, you know, what are the steps or what caused, or, you know, what is this device? And the successful story out of it is as the kids become more aware that there is that option in there, and you know, if they do something bad or they choose to borrow someone else's device and they shouldn't, there is a way for it to be discovered. So some clubs have went to use technology and infrastructure through security cameras to monitor what happens on that. I just wanted to add that in there.
Yeah, I was going to mention the same thing, Abby. And then, you know, on the other end, I think on the other end financially, one of the things we've done here at our club on the younger side is good old-fashioned Ziploc bags. And so each of our group leaders has a large, the jumbo size Ziploc bag. And so I think to Brian's point, outside of that parking lot time, if it's programming time and it's not time for kids to have access to their devices, each group leader is able to put, phones in that bag. They have a bag. The bag is secured at the front desk, locked. Only staff have access to it. So that way we can prevent that. In the teen space, it is, and I think in both, it's a part of another, again, evolving challenge, because you go back to the citizenship question and what type of atmosphere and culture you're promoting in your club. You're dealing with the fact that some of the young people that are coming into our doors, as we get them and we are shaping and molding them, they're coming in from some different backgrounds and environments where, stealing is okay, it's acceptable. And so helping to address that, addressing, again, that culture where we are a family, we are connected, those are the things that we should not do in the teen center space. I'm actually sitting in our studio, and we have cameras that we bought from Best Buy for about $100, that literally you just install into the ceiling. I don't know if you can see one up there. There it is in the top. And so we're actually going to go back now and put some more of those in our teen center, so that we are able, to Evie's point, to be able to see. And at the end of the day, promote, again, this is a safe space. This is a safe place. So I think ideally, we've got larger, more expensive cameras in some of the main spots of the club, but you are literally now able to go to Best Buy, Target, Walmart, and go pick up, these cameras that you can install yourselves for, $100 or so, that I think in a lot of cases you can view the footage from a device.
Great, thanks. So we are approaching 3 o'clock, but before we go, I want to point out a few relevant resources. So, of course, the Bring Your Own Device template is a resource that we hope is helpful for clubs. That's at bgca.net/STEM. Also, since a lot of the questions that we saw around digital citizenship had to do with social media, so if youth are taking pictures on devices and posting them on social media, what should clubs be ready for? There is a social media handbook for clubs on bgca.net/marketing. Finally, if you are thinking that you want to think about safety in general, as many of our panelists mentioned, some of the safety issues that come up with digital engagement are not terribly different from the safety issues that we had in a physical space as opposed to a digital space. The key safety policies checklist is also linked here in the resources. And then finally, since one of the biggest and most important aspects of digital citizenship has to do with how people treat each other online, I wanted to share a few resources related to cyberbullying. So one is that on My.Future, which is accessible at myfuture.net, one of the modules that we provide for clubs is discussing cyberbullying. So I would recommend, if you've never done that, that you try that out in your club. Additionally, because October is Cyber Safety Month, there are additional resources on bgca.net at this additional link, and that is going to include things like conversation cards that give you scenarios that might be difficult to think through with regards to online engagement. That could be a great conversation to have with your staff or with teens or with youth. So that's an option. And I'm also going to send out a few resources from Common Sense Media if you want to go deeper into this conversation of how to prevent cyberbullying, whether you're someone that might be in a gray area, whether a youth is in the gray area of teasing, whether they're feeling like they're encountering cyberbullying, or whether they want to be an advocate and stand up for some of their friends. Finally, the last resource that I want to point out is something that I'm excited about as a way for us to continue this conversation moving forward. I think that it's always helpful for club staff to know what other club staff are doing and what's working really well. And so there's a Google Doc linked here as a bit.ly, which is just the template of the Bring Your Own Device policy, but anyone with this link can add comments. So I would encourage you to glance through it and maybe comment on the places where your club has made specific accommodations or comment where you have a question. And we'll hope that other people in this online learning community can respond to your questions and give you some advice. If you're someone that really likes next steps, I'm planning to send out a few suggested next steps for making a plan, for deciding what your expectations are going to be, for messaging your expectations, and for knowing how to enforce your expectations. So that's something else to look for. Finally, I want to thank our panelists. Thank you guys so much for sharing your insight and your experience. I really appreciate your hour with us. And thank you to all of you for joining us, and more importantly, for devoting your career to the critically important work of youth development. So thanks so much, and please follow up if you have any questions.